All right, team. Today, I'm excited about this session because from this session, there's so many cool things that came out. Um, and we did a Clubhouse chat the other day, and we had a whole bunch of people who had podcasts, and we're talking about what a podcast professional sounds like. So, or what is what is a podcast professional? And there were like different sort of answers in there, like a good interviewer, having good sound quality, having humor and entertainment, giving the listener value, giving them transformation, connecting with their audience, making it feel like it's effortless when they create their content. So there was all different sort of like definitions for what a professional podcaster look like. But if I broke it down, I thought that for someone to be professional, there were three things that needed to happen. They needed to be prepared for themselves, which ticks the boxes of making it look like it's effortless. And then being consistent and trustworthy for your audience and your guests and those kind of people. So today, what we're going to do is work on being professional, because what we don't want is to have a haphazard show, haphazard approach to the show. And it's not our fault because it podcasts are very new. It's not like this has been done for a long time and everyone knows how to create podcasts for business and all this kind of stuff. So people are trying to learn and understand what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. So we kind of get into missing steps. We get into having inconsistent content, and then we think that the podcast, to have a professional podcast, all we got to do is focus on how it sounds. So we get a great microphone that looks great, and forget that there are other steps involved. So in my opinion, there's just like three things to be professional. You just got to know what works. You got to remove items that are not required, that doesn't suit you. And then you just got to test and measure to see how that works out. So I'm going to give you five principles to be a podcast professional. But before that, while we were doing this content and putting this unit together, James said something that I think is really valuable. He said, you can't have professional results with amateur foundations. So today we're going to work on our foundations, and we're going to do some really cool stuff. So 5 principles to be a podcast professional. Number 1, it all starts with your podcast promise. So what is a podcast promise? What do you consistently show up with your podcast to deliver to your audience? Do you know what it is? Does your guest, if you're interviewing this guest, do they know what it is? Does your audience know what it is? And this is a good test. If you meet an audience member on the road and they have listened to your podcast, will they repeat your podcast promise back to you? Okay, that's the first principle. What is your podcast promise? It should align with your business so that whatever you deliver in your podcast equates to business results, right? Number 2, second principle, cadence. Cadence is a really underrated term in general. Even in sports, it is an underrated term, but it is the most powerful term because as soon as you get cadence, it doesn't matter how fast or how slow you are. As soon as you get cadence, you start to hit rhythm. When you start to hit rhythm, you start to get into flow. And when you get into flow, you start to make and create things that are like not on plan. Okay. So 2, cadence and doing consistent stuff is your second principle. The third principle is basics first. So when it comes to podcasting, I spoke about the podcast promise as the first value. So the strategy on how you take that podcast promise and put it out into the world is your third principle. So branding, trust, like branding is a really important factor. Like, for example, if your podcast promise is trying to portray trust and the images don't look like they are done professionally, because you can tell if the text is out of alignment, if the design elements don't align, that is a surefire way to have mistrust go out into the world. They won't be able to tell you why they don't trust working with you, but unconsciously, that's a big negative sign, right? So branding is really important in this whole, in the principle of things. Number 4, use our workflows. So James has got win the day workflow as part of this. So we're going to give you that. Should I start a podcast and the psychology of entrepreneurship, all our workflows. So just use our workflows and then take that workflow and edit that for your business and podcast. You don't have to do everything that we do, but at least you're not starting on a blank page, right? So what does a podcast professional look like? At least you kind of have a rough idea, and then you can go, James does that. I think that's too much. Ronsley does that. I think that's too little. It's probably going to be the case. So you can mix and match to see what process works for you. All right. Okay. So first, we're going to get prepared, and we're going to do a lot of workshop and templates. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of stuff to do the prepared part. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips and tricks for you to be trustworthy in the content you create and the work you put out. And then I've got a really cool tool for you to be consistent. What I'm keen to know from you is what about that seems that you can apply to your business this month, right? What about what I've just said can you actually take and implement? What excites you about what I've just said? Can you put that in the chat? That would be amazing. Happy anniversary, Sandy. Cadence. Yeah. Amazing. Leveling up. Super clean. Yeah. Podcast promise. Let's go back. That's probably the first. Everything starts and ends with that. That is just the most important thing. Consistency, clarity. Yeah. Amazing. Because when you take podcast professional, the word professional could mean so many different things. That's why we equated professional to prepared, trustworthy, consistent. So then prepared, trustworthy, and consistent also are vague terms, really. Like, what does it mean to be prepared? What does it mean to be trustworthy? What does it mean to be consistent? So creating this training has been really, really amazing because we have, like I said, workshop and templates to be prepared, tips and tricks to be trustworthy, and a tool to be consistent. And now, not only that we know that we can tackle all these things, we want to see how that works for you and how you can implement it straight away. So the idea here is that you take this and implement it straight away. So if you're finding difficulty, please, this is probably the highlight. If you find difficulty in applying this, please get back to us. That is key. We want you to apply this. I don't want this to be a fancy video in our portal, right? I want you to take this training and apply it. So if that's not possible and you run into roadblocks, please do multiple things. Turn up on the weekly coaching every Tuesday. If you're in the future in Australia, it's Tuesday for us, Monday for America. So we've got weekly coaching, and then we got monthly masterminds and monthly intensives. So you should not really have, and then obviously the WAM retreat. So you should not really have any issues to reach out if you have obstacles to implement any of the trainings. Okay. All right. So if you can go to page 5 of your workbook, we've broken everything down so that it's not unclear as to what you need to do to be prepared, trustworthy, and consistent. Okay, so the first things we're going to do before the break, we're going to work on being prepared, and we'll do the workshop together. So by the time we're done, you will be 80% prepared than like all the podcasters out there, right? So the plan is that we'll do some work now so that you're more prepared. We'll tackle that first, and then we'll take a break and do some tips and tricks really quickly, and then I'll give you access to this tool, and let's see what kind of issues you run into when you get access to the tool, because it calculates a whole bunch of things for you and stuff like that. So let's get into that. So if you can go to page 5 of your workbook. Let me just share my screen. Share. What can you see, team? Can you see it?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. I can't see anyone's faces. Where's everyone gone? Where is everyone? Okay, just know that I can't see you all, which might not be a bad thing. No joking. All right.
People are making faces at you, Ron.
So let's work on being prepared, right? The 3 things that we got to do to be prepared. If we could have a before recording checklist, something to help us get prepared for the show, have something that we could do during the show in case stuff happens, and have a cheat sheet, and then have recording rituals afterwards, that would help us to be prepared. So let's start with before recording. So if you'd like to take notes, I really want to see your faces. This is really weird. Sorry, team. There you are. Lovely faces. When I do podcasts and do intros and do them to a blank mic, that is just the most boring part of my day. So actually, it's just communicating with people is just so much better. All right. So to be prepared, these are just principles, right? So just think what works for you and what doesn't work for you. The time slot. Do you have your time to record it in the calendar? Is that sorted? And I'm going to give you a link here to James. Actually, the link is going to be in the WAMLy tree under this unit. It'll be James' whole win the day workflow. And I believe that his initial part of sorting the time slot and having that Calendly part is like something that you can really copy. So do you have that time slot in the calendar? Have you created a pre and post buffer? So for example, if you are recording for an hour, do you have 15 minutes before at least and 15 minutes after as a buffer? Like, I don't think we do these things. And by the way, that buffer will save you hours of stuff later. And I'll tell you what to put in that buffer as well. If you're kind of going, okay, what if I don't even know what to do with that 15 minutes? There's lots to do in that 15 minutes. And then with the time slot, kind of want you to figure out, are you clear and are your guests clear on how to connect? Like how to connect, how to use the platform. So if you're using something like Squadcast, knowing that there's no chat or that's an issue. So telling your guest if it's the first time they're connecting, if they're on Zoom, chances are they know what to expect. But if they're connecting on some Riverside FM or some new platform where you're recording this interview, are they clear on the logistics of how to connect? All right. did the time slot part make sense? So if you're prepared and you have that, you and your guests will be way ahead rather than having them to explain to like what you want to avoid is an email 5 minutes after the calendar invite starts saying, I can't connect. Because that takes away from your interview, that takes away from the content you're going to create, that takes everything away from you. And it's a small fix, a really small fix. Does that make sense? The landing? Okay, cool. Amazing. So the next is the episode plan. So if you go to page 6 in your workbook, let's fill this first part out right now. So if you can first start like say today's date, or actually let's do this for your next episode. So whoever you're going to interview next, or maybe you're not an interview type show and you're creating a monologue type show, even then you kind of go, this is the date that I'm going to do the recording. So put that date in. So maybe mine is 3rd September 2021. And I'm going to have James on the show. And James with double T, I think. No, maybe. I don't know. Probably. So if you can just fill out that first line, that would be amazing. So when is your next interview? Who's the guest? And what's the guest website? Everyone good? Who's still doing that? Tim. For the others who have finished, I would like you to write in the first box the one call to action that you want to have for your whole podcast. Call to action is go and get my lead magnets. It can't be anything else. The call to action is you need to get the information from them. So they need to go and fill out something to give you their name and email address. That is a call to action. Okay. For a business podcast, that is your call to action. So in that box 1, can you please fill your one call to action for your podcast? I would like to clarify if that did not make sense. So please unmute anyone. Made sense? Thanks, Brett. But I'm happy to re-explain if it did not. And if you're struggling with 2 call to actions, Rowan, you look lost. Are you okay?
I was unmute. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on, like, for example, visit a website as a call to action, as opposed to, for example, a lead magnet where you can get someone's email address?
Yeah, I think that's a waste of call to action. That's a wasted call to action because you're not capturing anything when they go to the website. You want, if you're sending them to the website, you say, go to the website and then click this button so I can get your details, or click this button so that you can download this transformation lead magnet, or whatever that looks like. As long as you can capture their details for a business, that is your call to action, period, I think, in my opinion. And I'm happy to be debated on that topic as well, by the way.
And Rowan, just to think about that in terms of like at least like a little bit of urgency too. It's like, go to my website. Like it's just, yeah, it's like, obviously I know you wouldn't just say like, go to my website, but I like to think about that in terms of urgency. Like, what is the end result, and creating some urgency around the value that they're giving.
Yeah,
Actually, that's a really good point, Rowan. That's a really good point, Rowan and James, because like when you're thinking about a podcast listener, the podcast listener doesn't care to go to your website, right? They're not like, "Oh, I'm so keen to go to Ron's website." They're kind of going, I just listened to this podcast. I want to know what my next steps are. That's when I want to go and do something, right? So for your podcast, if your podcast promises that you will have more time or freedom, whatever it is, and your lead magnet is not delivering that, and not saying, hey, if you want more time freedom in your business, I'm making up an example right now. If you want more time freedom in your business, I've got a checklist for you to go through that in 10 minutes will give you an hour back in your calendar. I'm again making stuff up. Please go and get this at getmoreenergy or getmoretime.com, right? That's your podcast promise, because you're saying this podcast gives you more time. And if you want to get more efficient and more time in your business, then I have a product or a service that helps you do that. Does that make sense? In that straight line? Sorry, Katharina, can you unmute? What do you mean?
Oh, yes, I made a previous comment which Megan replied to.
Sorry.
So it was, can you have 2 lead magnets, one more generic for the podcast and one specific for business?
My suggestion is to get known for the one lead magnet. So on your podcast, only because the biggest issue that we have is honing, is focusing, is niching, is we want everything. And if we're not niching and honing and focusing, we're not going to get the results that we're after, because we need that initial bunch of fans to create that big spike. So my opinion is to streamline everything and get known for one lead magnet. By the way, there's nothing wrong with evolving your lead magnet as well. So for your first 10 shows, you could have version 1. For the next 10 shows, you could have version 2. James?
I completely agree. We mentioned that in a bit more detail during the last monthly intensive, so you can go back and review that. Like if you talk so much about, it's totally fine to have more, but the more you have, the more distraction and complexity it provides. And it's a bit like it's easier for you to not sit still and not gain traction. You're sort of going too wide rather than too specific. And it's also important to recognize that not everyone is ready to buy at every time. But when they are ready to buy, that's when you need to be front and center. If there's a message that they've heard you repeat over and over again, being something that's super valuable to help facilitate that, then that's going to be really, really worthwhile. Sorry, you're muted, Rons.
Thanks. So for us, it would be, if you want recurring results for your business using a podcast, go to recurringresultsroadmap.com and get the roadmap. I'm just putting it out there. That's our one call to action for us. Okay. Now in the next box, can you put 2 call to engagements? And let me phrase what a call to engagement is. Actually, Sandy might be the best person to talk about call to engagements. It's when you get your audience to participate in your show, right? Radio does that way too often, and podcasters don't know how to do that. So Sandy, do you have anything to say to that? Like, how you do many things as a radio host to engage the people listening. What are those things? And you could give us some examples.
Well, put me in the spot. No, a lot of it, I think, is just the tweak of everything you say needs to start with them. You have to relate and get into their world. So, what's an example? Like if you're feeling overwhelmed, like me, if you're like me who feels this, and that, then like it's always talking to them, because people are very they're thinking about themselves, right? So they want to know what's in it for me. So if you always talk to them like you are just talking to them, you're doing this podcast just for them, and you get into their world with every post you do, every time you do your show, the more, if you start a sentence with I, you started the sentence wrong, is what we are taught in radio. Never start with I or me. It's always you. I don't know. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Like totally 100%. Every business owner who's thinking of building their brand and doing all this fancy stuff starts with I and me. They I did a keynote recently for live people, real people, and I did the speak your truth part, and I was getting them to speak their truth, and almost always they started with I've got to do this because they don't know, and I'm like, no, what's your truth? Why do you care? Why are you in this? Oh, because they have to do. I'm like, fuck them. Like, what about you? And it takes so long to focus back, first to start with you and kind of then go to them, because then you know exactly how to refer to them, right? In when you're talking about your engagement. So radio does this amazingly. If you are relating to something like this and you feel and you understand what we're just talking about, please call this number right now. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to help you out. That's engagement with the show. Like you're getting them onto the show. They're engaging with the content you've created. Another example of call to engagement is if this kind of, if you're listening to this and it makes sense, and you think that there's someone else who could give us a better perspective, can you send us an email and give and let us know who that person is? Psychology of Entrepreneurship, so many people refer other guests to us to interview because they're like, oh, this person, like that's how I got, for example, the death row entrepreneurs, right? That was another one. Sandy, you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. When you said that, it just made me think of because oftentimes when you're interviewing someone on the podcast, everybody agrees. You're all on the same page because you're picking your guest because they align with your beliefs. But if it's too one-sided, it becomes wallpaper and you're alienating the people who don't fully agree with you. So sometimes even if you agree, you could say, hey, some would say, you and I believe strongly this way, but there are some people listening right now, or some would say, blank, blank, blank. What would you tell them? If you are one of those people, please reach out to us at any time. This podcast is your podcast. We'd love to have you on to give us your take. So it's almost like they're sitting there right next to you and you're inviting them in, even though it might be a delayed, but just some kind of reaction there. It's just you and them. I often say you're at a table, you and the guest, and your podcast listener you don't ever want them to feel like they're at the table next to you listening in. They're sitting there right next to you. You've invited them in right next to you to join in on the conversation. Now you're getting me all fired up.
I knew I just had to poke the bear a little bit. So
yeah, you did. Sorry.
Welcome to the woods, Sandy.
So good, Sandy. So good. The way that your business transitions as far as bringing the community and getting more clients, that simple shift from I to we, like you're in it together, that's so valuable. Like the word you is very, very important with a lot of those truth speaker things. When you can bring people, when you can change I to we, and I believe the reason so many people say I, it's because of ego. But if you turn that into we, just watch the way that people come into your cause and your movement and everything that's going on. It's so powerful. It was a few months ago, some of you might remember when I did a post that was in the WAMLey Facebook group where it was talking about what's the problem with this post. And it was like every single sentence was I. And it's just so common with these internet guru marketers. It repels people. Like you're not trying to force this stuff. You're trying to bring them into your community and your family. And the word we, I really believe is the single best word to be able to do that.
Amazing, Sandy. That That was baller. More of that. That's why I love you like when you get fired up on the Clubhouse.
I'm a little bit intimidated on the Clubhouse though, because you and James have like the best advice. I'm a little intimidated.
Well, we love having you, and I think I like not talking because everyone else has so much advice, and I only just kind of try to direct and say, hey, like James was just on fire yesterday. It was like literally was. All right, team. So in that second box, please write 2 call to engagements that you can have on your podcast that furthers your listeners' cause and gets them to engage with the show and engage with you and the content that you've just created. So 2 call to engagements in that box, please. So just for context, I believe to have an episode plan, you have to have 1 call to action, 2 call to engagements, 3 topics to cover, and 4 questions to ask at the minimum for you to have a good episode plan. Does that make sense? Right. So if you can do the 1 call to action and 2 call to engagements, you're pretty much prepared for any future podcast that you're going to record. So please fill in the 2 call to engagements now. Thank you.
Ron's, Hugh just asked if you could just repeat that in instruction, please.
Or 2 call to engagements, Hugh, in that second box. So just for your business, for example, yeah, unmute, yeah.
I was gonna say the other stuff. So you said 1 call to action, 2 calls to engagement, 2 topics, and what else? What was it?
It's in that sheet on page 6. 3 topics to cover, 4 questions to ask. So 1 call to action, 2 call to engagements, 3 topics to cover, 4 questions to ask.
Thanks, man.
For me, for example, in this example, if I was interviewing James, for me, my call to action would be, if you want recurring results for your business using a podcast and you want to scale your podcast, download the recurring results roadmap and diagnose yourself in the next 5 minutes. 2 call to engagements would be for my show, Should I Start a Podcast, would be, have you started a podcast yet? And if you have, I would love you to send me your podcast link. Everyone wants to send their link to other people, right? So if they're already a podcaster, that's would be my call to engagement. That would be my example. For James, topics to cover would be, how did you get on other people's show without having a podcast yourself? The second topic would be his podcast development journey, because he started as a monologue podcast and then went into an interview style show. And then third topic to cover for me would be, how did your content change after you became a dad? Right? Those would be my 3 topics to cover. Questions to ask would be, what was most intimidating about writing your 3rd book? So those are specific questions for James that I want to ask him, that I want to put that into my plan somehow. So I'm going to steer the conversations to the topics and the questions to ask. And it might seem on all my podcasts that I'm not prepared and I'm winging it, but fuck, I'm more prepared than everyone else. Like it just seems like, and I get this a lot, by the way, let's just do it like Ronsley and wing it. Ronsley doesn't wing shit. Like, it just comes across that Ronsley's winging it. I don't know how to fix that, but it's been happening my whole life.
I've got to share this. I've got to share this story, Ron. The other day, there was someone who was who knew Ron's, and he said to me, "Oh, let's just do this podcast interview like Ronsley, eh? What do you want to talk about today?" And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I've just opened up your website. What do you want to talk about? I'm like, I don't know. You're the one interviewing me. What the hell are you talking about? You ask me whatever you want. So he was not even remotely prepared. And let me tell you, as a person who was interviewed for that one and on Ronsley's show, there was a vastly different experience. So I think being effortlessly doing all the preparation behind the scenes makes it a lot more effortless on the day. And to be honest, I think I could even I do a lot of research, but I need to get better at making that more effortless on the day and relying less on the notes and more of a rigid structure for the episode, or what I believe the episode should be.
Yeah, and the way I see it is this preparation is you doing the laps around the ground, and when you're doing the interview, it's game time. Because that once you capture that, that's it, right? You can take hours to then process it and make it sound whatever you want, but that capture is game time. So if you're prepared and you've done your reps and you've done the gym sessions and you've done your laps and you've turned up to training, when it's game time, you don't worry whether you're prepared. You're just in the game. That's what I want for everyone here. Cool. All right, we're going to move past the episode plan. So when you get a chance, fill out the 3 topics to cover and the 4 questions to ask for your next interview. I'm going to give you some suggestions, because the other day what we did was, so what I've started to do, or what we've started to do is, from the roadmap, we do each time we do a clubhouse session, we pick one unit from the roadmap. So that we've done now 11 sessions, first 11 units, and we've spoken about different things and different topics on the clubhouse. And it's really helpful because it really helps create content, but also it helps bring more perspectives together. So the other day we were talking about being prepared. This was like 5 or 6 weeks ago. But one of the best, for me, I don't think there's a person more prepared than James in general. Just in general, I think he's probably got a plan for his daughter exactly, probably, I don't know. But anyway, let me just say that James in this session gave all of the people on the clubhouse a great sort of suggestion on how to be prepared really well when someone has a book, right? So when someone's an author and you get their book, read the first, actually, James, you're probably better to say this than I am. Can you please? It was a great hack on how to consume someone's book and be prepared in like less than 10 minutes.
Absolutely. So if you've got a guest coming on your show and you're like, oh God, I'm really behind the 8 ball here on preparation, assuming this person has a book, go to Amazon. You're going to be able to read in almost every instance a pretty good chunk of that person's book. So even if you haven't read the book, you can rip into it, go through the first 20 pages. It's going to enable you to be able to say, in your book, you mentioned that. And it's a really great way of being able to do that. And there's, as well as, not to mention, the testimonials. People who have given them testimonials for that book are also great people for you if you set up the interview the right way. And they say, what can I do to help you? You can say, look, I noticed that this person gave you a testimonial in your book. If you'd be open to connecting me with that person so I could feature them on the show, I'd really appreciate an introduction, something like that. So the preparation of Amazon in 5 minutes can be effortless. There's a whole bunch of other tips and things I can share on being able to, maybe we can do that in a separate coaching call, but as far as being able to get through someone's book very, very fast if you've actually got that in front of you too.
Yeah, reading the first and last paragraphs of each chapter is just like a great hack. There are other ones that were mentioned in there to be prepared. Consume 3 other episodes that they've done so you are aware of their tone of voice, etc. And then a LinkedIn scrape was another suggestion. Just looking at their LinkedIn profile will help you be prepared, as opposed to having someone like the other day saying to James and quoting me for some dumb reason, saying, let's do it like Ronsley. And what do you want to talk about? Let's open your website. What?
Crazy. That guy had also said he'd lost passion for his podcast as well. So it was almost a bit of a therapy session that I was not expecting. Rons, if I could just quickly interject here, to me, there's one thing I don't think I've actually shared with the Wamley or even on Clubhouse before, as far as preparation and comfort before a podcast when you're interviewing someone. It's listening to them at a minimum days in advance, even if you're not actively taking notes on what you're listening to while you're cooking, while you're driving, while you're walking, whatever it might be. That way you feel like you've already had a bunch of conversations with that person. So you're catching up more as a friend rather than being a little bit nervous potentially about this person and what question that you're going to ask. And when you have that, it means that you can be a lot more present rather than being on your toes, because most podcast interviewers, they're going to get, like, if someone asked you after you asked a question, what did you say again? If they've already been answering it for 60 seconds, like, what was the question again? So you've got to think about, what is the question that I'm currently asking? What is the question that I'm going to ask next? And what is this person saying right now? You've got so much to focus on. But if you've already had these conversations as if you were a friend of this person for, at least a couple of weeks beforehand, it doesn't need to be for very long durations. That's what just gives you that comfort. Like, you've already had these conversations with them previously. It makes it so much more comfortable in my experience.
Yeah, 100%. So that last part there, again, I think in James' workflow, you'll have some of this stuff, but just to touch on it, make sure the mic is on and the sound is clear for both you and your guests. Levels are not too loud. Right, that's probably the worst thing that can happen is if you have any sort of how to explain clipping. So if it's so loud that you see red on your recording parts, it's too loud. And if you can't hear it and it's too loud, you just don't want it to peak because it cuts off audible decibels that you can't really recreate. So make sure it's not too loud, and it's better it to be soft than it being loud, but make sure it's not too soft. Having a procedure to connect, making sure that if your guest says, hey, I'm not sure how to connect, you have a list, a step-by-step, do this, and you can just copy and paste and send that. And obviously this one is for me, actually, just make sure it's recording. I've had great interviews, amazing conversations, and I haven't hit the record button. Oh, anyway.
I have hit the record button and then there was something wrong with the cord. And there was my last podcast, I had to re-record 3 times with the same person. We were both completely over it by the end of it.
Yeah. That it was a conversation, so it's fine to have a second interview, but that having it 3 times, oh my God, I can imagine. All right, team. Let's see how much time we got. James, what do you reckon? Another few minutes?
Yeah, it's good. Another 10, 15 minutes. Yep.
Okay, cool. Let's just back up. Can you see my screen? Yep, great. Okay, so we did the episode plan. Now, just going back to this sheet, I'm just showing you what we're covering, right? So we've done the before recording checklist right now, and now we're going to go to during recording cheat sheet. So let's go to page 7 of your notebook. And in page 7, you'll see up the top here, the first thing is, do you have an episode plan that's complete, right? So if you have an episode, this is during the recording, so you should have this. If you have this sheet, would be great. So like you kind of go, yep, I've got my template, it's complete, which is what we did before. Yep. Yeah. And the next thing is, what do you want them to know? What do you want them to know before you start recording? Right? You've got this guest on, you've got to give them context for things. What exactly do you want them to know before the recording starts? Can you put that in the chat, please? So for all of you podcasters here, can you in the chat put, when you start interviewing someone, what do you want them to know before you start recording? What do you want to get out of the way before you hit the record button? I've given some examples here. For example, asking how to pronounce their name is a great one. The second is telling them who your audience is and what the podcast promise is of your show. And maybe another one is, letting them know exactly when recording starts. So you kind of say from now on, it's on the record. Sometimes we have, Zoom already recording. So just keeping them comfortable. So what kind of stuff do you want your guests to know before you start interviewing them? Can you write that in your page? So up that in the pre-record monologue and directions. Say that again, Elizabeth, can you explain that? What do you mean?
So I'm pretty thorough with my pre-questions, and they get a really good structure of the what's going to happen on my podcast. But a lot of them think that I'm going to ask every single question that they've been supplied with. So I just sort of say to them, look, I may not ask all these questions. I'm going to see how the conversation flows. And the only other two things I do say is I say, look, if you make a mistake, just say the sentence again, just keep going. And if you say anything that you don't want to include after you've said it, just say, I don't want to include that. I just want to delete it and we'll edit it out. Because I think that takes people a bit off edge, because I don't want to catch anyone off guard and I don't want it to be that kind of interview. Amazing.
Like that, I think is really valuable. So if for people that felt that was valuable, you should write that right now in your pre-record monologue and directions, so that you're aware the next time that you can say this, especially if you're not used to it, right? I know that it took me a while to ask someone how to pronounce their name. It's only after getting it wrong a couple of times and being absolutely embarrassed that I started to create this thing and make sure I ask how to pronounce the name before I start recording, because then it makes it extremely uncomfortable and awkward, because I'm trying to build this trust and then they're correcting me on how to build the name. Yeah, Mick, I hope everything's okay. Cool. Is everyone good with that? Can we move on? So
also,
yeah.
I don't, sorry, Ronsley, I don't know. One time, one of my interviewees didn't think they could take a break, like didn't think they could go to the toilet or anything. And it was just really weird. It never occurred to me to say that. So now I say, if you want to take a break or go to the bathroom, do that. And by the way, I put that on TikTok and it's got all these views. Hilarious.
So you're editing out some sound effects in post on that one.
Yeah, there's some great suggestions in the chat team, so please check them out. This is really, really good. We're going to add that to the training, so thank you for that. The next thing I want you to look at is just make five things that you want to have backup for in case shit happens. All right, I've given here a bunch of examples, but in the chat, can you mention what you'd like backup plans for in case shit happens during the interview? Okay, for me, connection dying is one. You can't hear your guest is another. You didn't understand what your guest said. The guest doesn't show. The guest reschedules last minute. You run out of questions and you freeze. You have brain freeze and you lose your train of thought. Those are my things to get you started. Can you in the chat put yours? Brett, I haven't heard from you, so I'd love to see your suggestions in the chat. So can you take some time to put that in here? That would be great.
Another one for anyone who's a parent having kids running halfway through. There's been a couple of times where I've been like, you get a bit embarrassed. And I had an interview. It might actually have been possibly with Tim or Rowan. I had one recently where I was a guest on the show and my daughter ran in and the host said, we could have just left that in the interview. Like, you could have owned it. And I was like, oh my God. Like, I just, instantly you go into professional mode and you feel bad, but owning something like that can be really worthwhile. So I think for anyone who's a parent, given the world we're in, what are you going to do when a dog or a little person runs into your recording?
Rowan, yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you know, but I used to DJ and play in a band a long time ago, and when you put plugs in, you use a tape to make sure that the connection never goes out in the middle of a concert, in the middle of a show. So for you, your roadcaster, make sure that you've double taped it. And if you want to go to YouTube, you can see how musicians, you must know this stuff, I'm pretty sure, but just double check or double plug it in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that. That's really helpful. I ended up buying a Zoom H6 so I can split the microphones, and so it records portable as well. Because a couple of sleepless nights, and it saves the stress.
Yeah, it's always good to have multiple places that it's recording, so for example, if I'm recording on Zoom, I'll have it recording on Adobe Audition as well, just in case shit happens. What did you buy, Rowan? Can you in the chat just put the Elizabeth asked a question about what you bought. So what I'd love you to do is have a look and see what you'd like to have a backup for in case shit happens. The bottom two on this list here, you're running out of questions and you freezing and having a brain freeze, just having a line that gets you start going again. I can't tell you how much it would help with the flow of everything. For example, you have a brain freeze, you forget your train of thought. And if you have a simple line that says, whatever the next question is, or have a line that brings everyone back to the promise of your show, saying, on this show, we're really focused on this. So you're having a line to immediately go into as soon as you notice your train of thought going off, just helps massively. So can you make a list and make sure that you are prepared in case any of that kind of stuff happens? And also make rules for yourself. Like if the guest reschedules last minute or they are a no-show, and you have a rule that if they're a no-show that you don't want to do the interview again, you don't have to make those decisions multiple times. You made that decision once, and that's the thing, right? So just having and taking care of these situations would help you massively. Cool, team? Amazing. All right. The last thing to be prepared, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we've done, James has covered a lot on this stuff, but the first thing, again, I would ask you to do is, after you record and you have that 15 minutes and this is done, say you finished the recording, what do you want? You finished the interview, right? What else do you want from your guest? What kind of content do you want them to give you? For example, James has, can you say, hey, this is Ronsley and this is Win the Day podcast as a bumper, right? Then he also has the 10 questions at the end, rapid fire questions, which comes at the end. It's after the interview, right? He's already developed the rapport, and then it's after the interview. So what last minute recordings do you want to have? Write that there. And once you do that, by the way, you're prepared. So can you take 1 minute right now and write what kind of stuff do you want to get in your guest voice before you say, all right, it's time we talk later? Can you please on page 8 up the top under 1, write what you want to cover. Also, when we under the unit in the Wamley tree, you'll see James' workflow for Win the Day, and in that as well, there's the bumper and last records at the end of that document. So you can copy his shit.
Literally copy and paste it however you want. Yes, I really don't mind. Do whatever you want to do.
So yeah, Brett, that's great. Like that's a great one, by the way. What's your most favorite quote? And then you can actually have that quote open the show. Yeah, you can create such cool things with these bumpers, and if you have the right rituals at the end, you can create some really, really good content. Okay, I'm going to move on because there's lots of stuff to cover. So the second thing is connect, network, give. This is all James. He's covered this extensively in a resource we already have for you. It'll be in the WAM tree under the guest extender. It's unit 16 of the roadmap. And we're not going to go into detail of this, but it's straightforward. It's connect, network, give. Very, very straightforward. James talks about it a lot. And the next thing is, again, this is what James talks about a lot, is the follow-up sequence. So being over-prepared and having a follow-up sequence for you, a follow-up sequence for your guests, and a follow-up sequence for your audience. So what do you want to do after you finish the recording, which is what we're doing right now? So you're extremely well prepared. What do you want your guests to do after they finish recording? What do you want your audience to do after they finish listening to your episode? So having that follow-up sequence and making sure that everyone knows what you'd like of them will make it extremely professional and well prepared. Are we cool, team? Are we good to move from the prepared part? Yeah, that seems way over prepared for me, but hopefully you can mix and match and see what works for you. But if you follow stuff in here, like, can you imagine how different your shows are going to be because of the stuff you capture and how you can change things around to make it more engaging on your show? Yeah. Cool. All right. Let's, James, how about we take a break and then come back and do trustworthy and consistent?
Perfect. Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break, everyone. And when you come back, we will keep it rolling.
Yeah, cool. Amazing. All right, team, see you soon.
Hey, Ron, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I go way back to your call to engagements. I always get stuck on that. Like, what works? Have you got? I like your idea about sending me that, but I always, when I know myself as a podcast listener, I'm normally in the car, so whatever you ask me to engage, I'm probably not going to do, because by the time I get somewhere where I can use my phone or a website, I've forgotten about it. So have you got any other ideas of what are good calls to engagement?
See, you know your audience best, Hugh. If you feel like your audience are not going to engage with your show while they are driving, mention that and be very clear. You're probably driving and you can't do this, but when you get off and you have the chance, I want to know from you as a vet how you whatever. Like, getting them to give their opinions back to you is what you need. That is a call to engagement, getting them to engage back with the show.
Yeah, thanks. I've tried and I don't often get much. It's funny, the subscriber podcast, because they subscribe and they are by nature more engaged. And it's funny because it's clinical stuff, so you think that they wouldn't, but I send the show notes out on that once a week as an email. And to make it fun for myself, I always write a weekly wisdom thing, like something I've read that week or something completely unrelated, something. And I get engagement on that. I'll often get people email me back about that and say, "Hi, yeah, this and this and this." And
Great. So I would use that in your show and say, "Hey, I do this weekly thing." I would say that that's the way that you would get engagement. So making sure that they listen to the content, engage with the content, and do something with the content. Otherwise, it's just infomercial, right? It's just info thrown at them. So getting them to digest what you've done and then respond back somehow. It could literally be a quiz, a tick mark. It could be anything. How can you get them to engage back with the show? Or it could be there is a common saying that most vets are unhappy in what they're doing because of the other procedures involved in keeping their business afloat. Most vets like the interacting with the animals. We're doing is that we're doing a survey. Go to the website and say if that's you or not. Yes and no. Very simply. And then once you have more than 100 respondents, you can say 54% of vets say that they're not happy with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, mate.
Cool.
How long are we breaking for?
About 7
Now
or 8 more
7
minutes.
minutes.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks. See you soon.
Cheers. Just from the prepared part that we just went through, is there anything that stands out? Any questions, any ideas that you feel like haven't been answered? Can anyone unmute and say if there's anything that you want to recover from the prepared part of today's section? No? Okay. So we before the break we covered we did a whole workshop and a bunch of templates on how to be better prepared, and I'd say that you are all more prepared with your call to actions and your call to engagements, and probably thinking about your podcast promise. So you're probably a bit more prepared than you were before we started this intensive, I'm hoping. Can you give me like a wave to the camera if that's the case? If it's not, it's totally cool. We're gonna just cover in your workbook. I'm gonna give you some tips and tricks to be more trustworthy with your podcast. Now, I just want to reiterate some of the things here, the fundamentals of podcasting with business. We talk a lot about attention, engagement, sales. Now, a podcast, we know for a fact, is the most engaging form of content. We know that because we can't compare it to a Facebook like or a Facebook scroll or a reel or a video or a blog post. No other piece of content can be compared to audio because of the engagement. On average, it's 49 minutes that people consume a podcast, which is a crazy amount of time. No other form of content can give you that engagement. So if your podcast is the engagement, we take your podcast where you make the engaging piece of content, and then we reverse engineer the attention pieces. So the social media, all the attention that you can get from new audience, and we direct the new audience into the engagement, which is your podcast. And from the engagement of your podcast, we want them to sell. So your sales come from the engagement of your podcast. That's how attention, engagement, sales work for businesses that have a podcast, right? So I want to focus on the engagement part because this is what we're doing right now. And I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to be more trustworthy with what you're creating. Okay, so if we go, I've broken that obviously down into 3 parts. The 3 things for you to be trustworthy is you got to create content that's in line with your podcast promise. So again, it comes back down to that podcast promise. Like, so what I mean by that, if you are a podcast host that's an accountant and you've created an accounting podcast that allows entrepreneurs to have freedom, but you just interview other people and in your regular episodes don't give your audience freedom every episode, then you are not in line with your podcast promise, right? So if you are saying that my podcast will give you more energy, and your audience has listened to the episode and they don't feel energized at the end, then it's not in line with your podcast promise. All right. So the first thing is for you to be in line with your podcast promise. The second is to have clean sound and have it well recorded. And then finally, it's about professional editing and publishing across all platforms. I will just talk about how to have stuff in line with your podcast promise so that I'm I'm giving you actually stuff that you can actually look at. So in the example of having more energy as a podcaster, say, you're a podcaster that gives your audience more energy. Is that mentioned in the intro? Do you mention that to the person you're interviewing when, you're giving them directions and you're saying, hey, my podcast gives my audience more energy, right? Are you mentioning that? Is it coming across in your content? Is it coming across in your call to engagements? So, for example, today we spoke to the sleep doctor about getting more energy through having better sleep. And if you struggle with your sleep, I want to hear from you. Okay, that's a call to engagement that is very unique to that particular show, and it will make it quite lucrative for people who actually listen to that show and get to the end and kind of go, yeah, I have an opinion about this. So that's how you keep it in line with the podcast promise. James talks about winning the day. He could potentially talk to anyone, but if he doesn't bring that back to how this episode is going to allow you to win the day, then it's not in line with this podcast promise, right? Psychology of entrepreneurship. If I'm not breaking down the psychology of the decision making of an entrepreneur in my episode, then I'm not in line with my podcast promise. Is that landing, team? Cool. So that's podcast promise. The second thing there is how to have clean sound and have it well recorded. It's kind of really simple. Really simple. Number one, have headphones. Number two, get a mic, a unidirectional dynamic mic. And we have a resource if you don't know what microphone. I think most people here know microphones, but we have a audio hardware equipment guide. If anyone's watching this later and you're kind of going, oh, I don't know what mic, please get that. The third thing is the environment. And it's probably the one that doesn't get mentioned the most. And we forget that the environment around us creates the final audio. For example, James, Sophie's around. Sophie is in the environment. So if Sophie screams, that's the environment. He's got to be prepared for that environment. So just knowing that is going to be part of his show, or if he doesn't want that to be part of his show, making sure that the environment changes. That's all. There's just three things to have clean sound and have it well recorded. It's not, we've made fun of the USB microphones and all the equipment and stuff like that. And that's not the consideration. Every audio snob will talk about the USB microphone, but if you're connecting your microphone to your computer, the device that takes analog signals and converts it into digital signals is present in your converter anyway. So if you use a USB microphone or you use a connector that goes from analog to this, it does the same thing and no one can really tell the difference. But if you want to be an audio snob, then you can go and say, I need analog signals and XLR and all that kind of stuff. Right now, you need just three things: headphones, microphone, and a good environment. Okay. Third, professional editing and published across all platforms. The first thing there is to edit like an author. Now, what do I mean by that? You would never read a book that's not edited. You would not read a blog post that's not edited. Why would someone listen to a podcast that's not edited? What do I mean by editing like an author? If you want to take your editing to the next level, what does an author do? They rearrange an editor for an author do. They rearrange the content so that the consumer understands the flow of the content, right? No one's bringing up chapter 13 in chapter 2. They're not it has to be broken down. So, for example, if you are having a conversation with someone about sleep and you have different small conversations, but maybe towards the end, this person says, if you've never gotten good sleep in your life, these are the first 5 things you've got to consider. I would make sure that that is at the start of my interview. That's what I mean by editing like an author. All right. Second, breaks, silence, music, voices, make it all sound more professional. Building in the silence, building in the breaks, building in the right music and tonalities, and making sure there are more voices than just yours really help bring out a podcast. And the third thing is making sure that it's available on all podcast platforms, right? So those are just some tips and tricks for you to have to build more trust into your podcast. Okay. So what I'd love to know from that, what kind of like made sense for you and what landed? Could you just put that in the chat? That would be extremely helpful. Just to clarify in the chat, what made more sense of the things I just covered under trustworthy? Yeah. Oh, cool. All right. This is really, I did like an author. That's interesting. I thank you for that feedback. I appreciate that. How do you aggregate audio if you're recording remotely? As in over Zoom?
Yeah, if you're on Zoom and many of my guests are not regular public speakers, so they're not always set up with good quality mics and stuff like that. So I struggle a little bit with that to make sure I get decent audio from their side.
Yeah, great question. So first thing is making sure you're recording separate channels. Your audio is on a separate channel. Yeah, great. Then
only recently swapped because of that. Yeah. I only recently swapped. It used to be Zoom, so then sometimes I'd have internet, but now I'm using Squadcast. Yeah.
I think Zoom, you can have, you can tick a box that allows you to have, to record on separate channels. Your guest on a separate audio channel.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I do that. I've always done that. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, great.
I thought you meant like the double ender idea where you record.
No. Just making sure that they're separate channels. That's the first thing. The second thing is when they're recording, if they just have earphones like you, and how Megan's got, and Kat, like that probably is going to be the second big difference. Okay. So making sure that they're not talking into their, so this is me talking to the MacBook. I don't know whether you can tell the difference.
I can vaguely, I can hardly even hear you there. Yeah.
So that is the microphone on the MacBook, right? So that's what it's picking up, and this is my microphone. So you being able to say or tell, like I've done this a lot, where someone's connected their USB microphone, but it's not connected to Zoom, and you can tell right? So that first thing, separate channel. Second thing, making sure that if they have any sort of like earphones and headphones is going to make the second big difference. And the other one is to make sure if they're wearing the headphones like you, is that the microphone is not rubbing against their. That's the best you can do.
So you'd be happy like for this mic on this thing if they don't. Yeah, you're happy with that. Okay, cool.
Because I can, once that is there, then I can add into Adobe Audition. I can remove the background noise separately from your channel, and then I can add, if I'm a good audio engineer, I can add bass, I can add all the equalizers to make sure that that sounds better.
And Hugh, in my experience, it's only podcasters who have good sound. Like I've been interviewing different people, and it's like I feel like a big part of that as well is just being okay with whatever they end up turning up with. You can only do so much, and if you get there, it's often not worth the stress and the complexity of trying to figure something else out. So that's what I've learned.
Thank you. That's what I kind of want to hear, because that's sort of what my view of it. But then I think, is that unprofessional? Should I be? You know, I've got a couple of regular guests, and I've actually sent them microphones as a gift, which is a good tip, by the way. People get $50 microphone and they love you forever.
Yeah, I did a virtual keynote for Success Magazine, who had a whole bunch of people like Jay Shetty and Mel Robbins and things, and they were like, "Oh my God, yours was so good." But little secret, the fact that I've got lights and a professional microphone and things, like they were doing it from their laptops. It's like when you watch a movie and like a really crappy resolution versus something like 4K. It makes a massive difference, just that appearance. But as a host, when I get other guests and things on the show, I have the process to make sure they rock up. It doesn't work anywhere near as effectively as I thought. So at the end of the day, the energy that you bring is a massive factor in the content that comes from that episode. And the content is by far the most important thing. Obviously, as much as you can, try and get a great outcome with the sound and all that stuff. It's important, but at the end of the day, the content is really king.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I also want to reiterate that, content creators and entertainers, before the internet came along, used to train a lot before we saw any sort of entertainment. And because we are thrown into this new battlefield where entrepreneurs have to entertain and put out content, any rep that you get is good. So don't compare yourself to the artists and all that kind of stuff out there. You getting the rep in is making sure that you get to be a better content creator and a better entertainer. And just keeping that in mind is going to be helpful. All right, team, I'm going to share my screen again. So I feel that if we go back to our page 5, before the break, we covered how to be prepared with the workshop and templates, and we did a whole bunch of stuff there. And then I just went through a bunch of tips and tricks to inject trust into your podcast and into your content. Now we'll talk about being consistent, and I've got a great tool for you all to be consistent. But I believe there are 3 things that need to happen for you to be consistent. 1 is you got to have a structured show. 2, you got to publish your show regularly. And 3, you got to have social going to new audience so that they know that there's a show that you got to bring new audience in. So those are just the 3 things for you to do for you to be consistent. Okay. So let's break that down. All right. For you to have a structured show, we've done this training in a previous resource. So once the trainings are in the portal, have a look at bubbles of your show, because we've covered that in the accelerators. What are the different bubbles that make up your show? Like there's an intro bubble, then there's maybe the intro music of your show. In Brett's case, there might be the first bubble might be the quote that this person has given, and then maybe there's the intro music, and then Brett gives an intro to the interview, and then the interview comes, and then in the middle of the interview there's a call to action, and then the second part of the interview, and then at the end there's an outro. All those are bubbles of your show. All right, so that's a sequence that people expect. They expect it as a listener, so you got to keep that in mind. The second thing is having a clear call to action. As a business podcaster, that is a must. Your call to action needs to be very clear, and it has to go to the business. And number 3, it has to reinforce your podcast promise. Again, if you notice, everything starts and finishes with your podcast promise. That's why it's the first value or principle I spoke about. The 5 principles. It all starts with your podcast promise, like making sure that you're aware of what that podcast promise is and you're constantly communicating it. That is like key. So let's go back down here. So what is a structured show? You have the bubbles of your show, you have a clear call to action, and it reinforces the promise of your show. Cool? Clear? Is that clear? Okay, cool. Second, regular podcast publishing. I'm gonna get into the tool sheet in a second, but I'm just gonna cover the last part. The third thing to be consistent is extraction. So extracting. So once you create your podcast, extracting the attention pieces to drive traffic to your podcast is the first thing. So you've had this great interview or you've created this content, you've got to create small bite-sized pieces so that new audience can know and engage and engage. No one wants to give 30 minutes of their time just away like that, right? So can you give them bite-sized pieces that get someone who's perfect for your show to engage and then get to your podcast? The second thing is, having like different assets to give your guest for exposure. A lot of the time, we don't even have those assets to give. And I have a whole bunch of examples for you. So, but assets to give your guests is the second thing. And the third thing is, once you have this, you can schedule them in Later or Hootsuite or in Buffer or in any of these different tools that allows you to schedule social media posts ahead of time. Now, here's a hack that we used to do for all our clients that I don't know why podcasters don't do. The hack is that if, say, this week I am releasing episode 100, okay? Say I've had a podcast and this week, episode 100 goes on to iTunes, Spotify, and all that kind of stuff. My social media posts for this week are going to be for episode 90. For next week, it's going to be episode 91. For a week after that, it's going to be episode 92. So my podcast audio goes out 10 weeks ahead of my social media posts. Am I making sense? So I am not rushed. Hugh, what is not making sense? Can you please unmute?
I know, I understand what you're saying, but I don't know why. That's what I'm waiting to hear. Why does it make sense to do it that way?
Oh, right. Because you're not rushing for content. So we're always 10 weeks ahead scheduled for social media posts. So you're never rushing for content. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to share, I totally agree with this. Because of the lockdown and me like enjoying doing interviews personally, we were 10 weeks in advance, and then obviously lockdown happened and it's all been a bit shit, to be frank. But then I thought, well, how can I do this differently? And number one, I've gone to some international architects, which means we'll go international. But last year I recorded our interns, and I made them do a podcast and made them tell everyone their experiences of being an intern in our association. And so we've actually come now, in about 4 more weeks, we'll come to the end of our pre-recorded content. And I've been able to now, we'll do an intern series, which will give me another kind of 4 weeks. So I just thought, if anyone, like, it's always good to have those things in the back pocket. And that's how I'm just trying to deal with it, because we still don't know when we're going to get out of lockdown. But anyway, I just thought I'd share.
Yeah. So just to make sense of the whole thing, thank you, Elizabeth. To make sense of the whole thing, you're releasing 2 bits of content. You're releasing your audio and you're releasing all your socials that come from the audio, right? So that you're never rushing, you have a bank of audio and you have a bank of socials. But if you have a bank of audio and and you're still releasing it on the day, on the week, you're still rushing for your socials. So you backdate your socials. So you're never rushing for your socials and you're never rushing for your audio. Make sense? Yeah, Hugh? Mainly, yeah, cool. All right, team. What I'm going to do is give you this tool sheet, if I can find it.
While you're doing that, Rons, I think so. The exception to what you said might be before, if YouTube, for example, if you're releasing something on YouTube where the first 24 hours of engagement is important, that you can drive traffic to that if you've got all that stuff ready to go, because that can favor the algorithm if you do things like social media, mailing lists, all of those different things to drive traffic towards it.
What do you mean, James?
Sorry, you know, when new content is released on YouTube and the algorithm favors eyeballs on it as soon as possible. So doing what you can do to get eyeballs on that, whether it's through social media, obviously it's a million times more stressful to be constantly on that. Like, what content have I got to get out right now? That's the difference between so something like YouTube can be great to drive those eyeballs towards it, but being far more organized and process driven, because if you've got great assets from your show, like I post things from my show that came out like a year ago, which is great, and it's far less stressful. But when my episode comes out, I also want to release content which is far more stress, but it can drive traffic to something like YouTube to help try and build that up in the hopes of getting with the algorithm for the first 24 hours.
Yeah. So it's basically a hack, right? If you just want to not, like, we never wanted to stress about our clients. We didn't want to stress about stuff. So we just created this system where, and then we could also measure based on that, how much organic growth the podcast was getting versus when we were sending socials to that episode. So this is really good. It's really good measuring tools. In the chat, I have put in a link to a tool sheet, which I will show you how to use right now. But the way to get access to it is that you go and make a copy. So you'll have to go and say File, make a copy, and make your own copy so that you can create it, so you can play with it. But this tool sheet this is what we used to use for all our clients, but it's actually improved. That's why it's 2.0, to make it more easy for you to use it. Obviously, when you get a chance, go through this whole list first. When you finish reading the list, it'll ask you to fill in your strategy sheet. So go into the strategy sheet, and there's only 7 questions that you need to answer for your successful podcast strategy. Now, I suggest, even if you've had a podcast for the last 5 years, to fill this out. It won't take more than 20 minutes. And you're going to fill out why, who, what, how, when. And when you get here, it's going to ask you, what episode are you going to start using this tool sheet from? So, for example, should I start a podcast? Is that episode 292? So maybe I'm going to start using this sheet from episode 300. Just say 300. But if you're just starting using the sheet, obviously it's episode 1. So 300. Then it'll ask you, when does episode 300 go live, which is the next box here. So you double click on that and I will say episode 300 will go live, say Friday the 15th. Okay. And I want to publish every 7 days. Okay. So I'm just showing you how to use this sheet so that you can do it for yourself. Once you put these details in, it will say, I've created a deadline guide based on what you've entered. So if you click on this, it'll tell you have episode 300 recorded by this date, and make sure that your episode audio is done by this date, it's extracted by this date, and it's posted on this date. So there's no second guessing about how much time you need to get stuff done, right? Go back to the strategy sheet. If you say this is episode 0, right, or say episode 1, and you're going to start for the first time, and you don't know what to get done before your episode goes live, here is a checklist for you. Set up a microphone, your Dropbox, confirm the title, all the things you need to do before your episode goes live. So it's a checklist 30 days before episode 1 goes live. Okay. So basically you fill this all out, you come to the bottom, where is my audience already? Which type of podcast am I going to create? Maybe it's a monologue, and maybe it's live one-on-one coaching. And you finish the sheet, and then you go into the publish sheet, which is the next one. Now in this sheet, basically based on what you've put in on the strategy sheet, it'll populate all your publish dates, populate all your episode numbers, and it'll tell you how many days you have before episode 1 goes live. Okay. If this is red, it means you're aggressive on your timeline. If it's orange, it means you're living on the edge. And if it's green, it means you've picked a decent amount of time to get this going. Now, for someone that is kind of going, hey, Ronsley, this strategy, I don't know how to answer these questions, there is a sample sheet here. So you can go to the sample sheet and you can just kind of read this out and use that as a guide so that you can maybe fill out that strategy sheet better. Okay. Same with the publish sheet. If you're like, what does this all mean? There's an example, but I'll explain this. In my opinion, there are seven stages to a podcast. Okay. The first stage is making sure it is scheduled, right? The second stage is making sure it's recorded. The third stage is making sure it's edited, right? The fourth stage is making sure you have a fully produced MP3 file. Then the next stage is extracting, making sure you've extracted and you have the social post for that. The sixth stage is publishing it, that audio file. And the seventh and final stage is the marketing or posting of the socials. Okay. So there are 7 stages from here to here for any podcast episode. If you're the talent and you have the money and the resources, your job is to only be present for the recording. Your job is to you only show up for the recording, everything else gets done. That's what Amplify specialized in. You're the talent. You just show up for the recording, everything else gets done. Okay. Now, for solopreneurs, when you start off and you have a small team and all that kind of stuff, you pick and choose how much of that gets done. Okay. So now I'm just going to show you an example of the publish. So you'll see here, I've given you, an example of 2. One is of should I start a podcast, and the second is of the psychology of entrepreneurship. What you will see here is that when you go to, let's say the first part, right, in the prep and the schedule, you'll see the one pager that my team has created for me to be prepared before I go into this interview. It has interview date. It has the podcast that this is for should I start a podcast, what his podcast is about, the websites I should check out, who is this person, why I'm interviewing this person, and just interesting facts. I promise you there are times that I haven't had a chance to do much research. I've clicked on join meeting and I've started to read this, and I'm way more prepared for the interview than not having this one pager. So this is how I prepare for every interview. How do I go back? Oops. Sorry, team. I don't know how. There it is. So that was Jay. I recorded, the record date was the 3rd of September 2020. It was edited on the 10th of September 2020. And this is what the MP3 file looks like. So you can go to the Dropbox and you can see the MP3 file. Then you can go to this extract folder and click on that, and you'll see all the assets that we created from that MP3 file. First, you'll see the breakdown. So now you'll go to this breakdown and you'll see the name, the guest, the episode title, the top 3 quotes. So this is for my content team. What keywords that we should use for the show notes. The meta description. This is, you can read all this. I'm not going to go through it. What's the Facebook post content? What's the Instagram post content? The hashtags, the LinkedIn post content. So you can see exactly how we've taken the MP3 file and reverse engineered the content first. Then we've taken that content and created images. So you will see all the images here. You will have a look and see what works. Then you'll see the show notes. I'm not going to click on that. But it gives you an idea of what we did to prepare, when it was recorded, what MP3 we got, what social we got from that, when it was published. And then finally, this is what it ultimately looks like on the website. So if you click that last tab, you'll see what that ultimately looks like, all done. Okay. So the same thing goes with the next example. This is only for you to look through, but then you use your publish sheet for your podcast. This allows you to keep track. The way I would use it is, say I have a James episode coming, I have a Stacy episode coming, I have a Catherine episode coming, I have a John episode coming, and my first thought would be, okay, I want to make sure I schedule this correctly. So as soon as I schedule the time with James, I will go, it's done. This is when it's, this one's going to be done there. This one's going to be done then. And you fill that all out. And then obviously do the edit part, so on and so forth. Use the publish example for your, to use your publish sheet. And then finally, once you have all that sorted, go to the metrics or the measure sheet, and it'll give you all the things that you have to measure, the 7 metrics you have to measure to make sure that your podcast works for your business. Okay. Now, in the publish sheet, once you finish creating this and you say, with James, the title of my show is episode 1. Maybe it's not episode 1. It is, say, Win the Day with James. And that's, I ultimately publish the show as Win the Day with James. This will automatically populate here. So your title will automatically be here. This is the date it was released. So you'll see that in your publish sheet, it's been published. And then 14 days after that, you enter these records. So how many episodes are completed and scheduled and waiting to publish, which means you have all the socials ready, you have all the MP3 ready, everything is ready, and all it has to do is it goes live. That's the number you put there. If that's 0, that's 0. If that's 1 or 2, that's 2. If you've recorded 6 episodes and the 6 episodes are in the bank, that's the number that goes in here. So how many recorded episodes you have in the bank. 14 days after this podcast episode is released, how many listens does that episode have? So if you have 50, that becomes 50. This is per episode, which is 50 divided by 1, which is 50. Do you have any leads from that? Maybe one person's downloaded the lead magnet. And then as a result of that, did you have any partnership conversations? And if it's nothing, then it's nothing. These are the 7 metrics that I promise you, if you keep track of, is going to make a big difference for your business. Okay. Now, this sheet will keep you consistent, but also make sure that all the other stuff is getting done. So you have examples of how to reverse engineer. Look at the breakdowns, especially both the breakdowns in this sheet, in this published example. Under the extract, if you go to each of these Dropbox folders, see how this breakdown has been created from the audio. So they listen to the audio and then they start filling this stuff in. So based on the audio that they listen to. Okay, so you'll see examples in there, how to create the quotes and that kind of stuff. If you need templates, please reach out. All this will be in the WAMly tree under the unit section. Okay, so what I'd love is, I went through a lot with this tool sheet. I'd like any sort of clarifications, because I think what's going to happen is it'll be easier once you start playing with it. But if maybe I've missed something or I haven't explained bits and pieces right, please ask me questions about that now. That would be great. Publish. Just making sure it's all blank. Is it all clear? No need for any clarifications. Is it all like straightforward?
Probably one of those things people need to sort of, just test it out a little bit to have a bit of a feel. But Ron's is so good. He literally has degrees in this type of thing. So he's very, very good. As far as things like automations, it's unbelievably useful. In fact, I learn something every single time he introduces something like this that I can implement in my own stuff. So figuring out what you can do to reduce some of those stress levels, to automate that process, figure out what you can outsource. Like there's so many levels of automations and things that you can implement. And Ron's has shared some really great stuff here. So hopefully that tool that is there is going to help you thinking about the bird's eye view of the business, because at the end of the day, the podcast needs to have some type of greater impact. What does that look like? Well, all the metrics and things are in there for you to use. And I just love the way little things like when you enter it in one tab, it goes into a different section, just little things like that to really be consistent and to save you a hell of a lot of time in the process.
Yeah. Also, you should not be able to change the formulas or any of that stuff. So if you can, let me know so I can protect that sheet so that you're not breaking anything on the background, because there's a whole bunch of code that's running in the background there. Hugh, for you to access that again, just click on the link that I've shared in the chat and read how to access it. It's the front sheet which says how to use this tool. It should be straightforward. Yeah. And that's me done. That is just, I just want to clarify a few things on this sheet. I believe that there are 7 questions to get your strategy sorted. That is in your strategy sheet. I believe there are 7 stages to getting your podcast published. That is in your publish sheet. And I believe there are 7 metrics that you should measure to have a successful podcast for your business. And that's in the measure sheet. Okay, so that's how that's all organized, just for context.